Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, your host for this episode, and a staff research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. And today, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Colonel KPM Das, adjunct fellow with the institution. Welcome to the episode, KPM.
Thank you, Anushka.
Right. So I thought today we could talk about the story of SATHI, which is a handheld battlefield computer, which was a pioneering but ultimately shelved project that could have transformed the Indian Army's battlefield operations. In our conversations before the recording of this episode, KPM, we discussed that this was a truly pioneering project in the sense that it had a lot of young practitioners leading it, and at its peak, it also beat the tech that the US military had deployed at the time. And I thought today we could rewind to the early 2000s when, the Indian Army was fresh from the lessons of the 1999 Kargil War. It realized that the infantry had the requirement for a project Beta, which was a visionary initiative to bring the Indian soldier on par with global counterparts in terms of digital battlefield awareness. And with this ambitious goal to equip every soldier with a rugged handheld computer came the SATHI, which is the situational awareness and tactical handheld interface. And of course, it attempted at least to answer critical questions in real time, right? Where am I? Where is the enemy? And where are my comrades? So, from that perspective, the tech was absolutely critical. So, from there to maybe today, in this conversation, the goal is to understand what was it that made the project so cool and pioneering, why maybe we couldn't go ahead with it, and the big $1 million question, right? Can it be kind of brought back? And if so, how? And KPM, we've done a lot of work on this. So let me just come to you with my first question. You understand the tech and the context on SATHI KPM. So what made this handheld device so special? And if you could maybe lay the land for our listeners, what were the specs? What did it run on? What kind of a receiver did it boast? And how did it fare on range and software? Over to you, KPM.
Yeah, thank you. So the year was 2000, a year after OPJ, the Kargil conflict. And, I was in a unit at that time, and I get
Right.
a from the Ministry of Defense saying that Mr. Arun Singh, the Minister of State for Defense and the Deputy Chief of Army Staff will meet you. Yeah. And when I went there, in the room were three stalwarts at that time from the academia and the industry. Professor Vijay Chandru, Professor Swami Manohar, and Vinay Deshpande, who was the World Economic Forum pioneer of that year. Yeah,
Right.
and two things brought serendipity central to that point of time. One was the computer had just been built by a bunch of techies who were in that room at that time. And two, we had a very pragmatic, progressive, forward-looking MOD at that time.
Right.
And we had made a commitment in MOD that we are going to pick up one technology which is world class and take it to the field. So that is how I ended up getting called, and soon after things started moving at a
Right. And during the process of the development KPM, what did you find were the key kind of pioneering and world class qualities of the SATHI that made it truly advanced for its time? How was it really going to help the infantry and the armed forces in coming into new age of warfare, as it were?
Yeah, sure. So there are two two aspects. One is the operational aspect, and two is the technical aspect. So when you come to the operational aspect, classically we had a lot of challenges while conducting counterinsurgency and counter-terrorist operations in Kashmir and the Northeast. Uh, Once you set out to conduct an operation, something like cordon search of a villages or a bunch of villages, all that you had were backpack radios and a bunch of maps, which were all paper based. And very often these operations would last for 72 to 96 hours. And during that period, the operational context would change. The militants would change their locations. And very often we would end up with a plan that really didn't work on the field. So we wanted something which captured the dynamics of position, information from the adversary, and so on and so forth. And there was clearly a need for a digital platform. And then the computer comes along. And then we decided to build an architecture with computer at the core.
Right. And what were the kind of features of the computer, or how were they integrated into what we know as the Sathi today?
Yeah, so computer was, from a processing point of view, it was the core. So we clearly needed a few things. We needed voice and data. And remember, this is almost like the internet days, especially in areas of operation like Kashmir and the Northeast. There's no internet available. So you had to build your own communication fabric based on radio, point to point radio. And we also needed GIS, Geographical Information System, because all the maps had to be loaded on that. And remember, this was at a time when even memories were very sparse, right? So you couldn't have heavy duty maps. You had to actually craft bespoke maps, which were very thin, yet gave you all the details that were there on the ground.
Yeah.
Additionally, we also needed a touch interface, which was almost unknown at that point of time, so that instead of having to yell orders on the radio, you could actually use your pencil and mark it on the map, and digitally it would communicate to all the people in the buddies in the team, all the sathis in the team, so to say. Yeah, so it brought a lot of flexibility and allowed a lot of freedom to the commander, who would invariably be a company commander or even a platoon commander or a section commander.
Right. And just from the experimentation at the time, however limited for which it was deployed, did it produce, in your opinion, outstanding results? For example, how did it operate on the function of range? Could it really allow you to be situated wherever in a widespread area and still be able to, as you said, communicate with your sathis?
Yeah, so that's a good point. That in fact was the major challenge. We began very ambitiously with a range of 2 to 5 kilometers, with whatever hardware we could secure at that point of time. Realized that in real operations, especially when a soldier is on the ground, kind of kneeling or crawling, ranges go down substantially. And then we, brought it to a more modest 1 to 1.5 kilometers. And we then had to then look at the protocol, communication protocol afresh. And we had a team member, Ravi, who actually was the architect, technical architect, uh, who came up with something called Grapevine, a protocol built for Sati, which actually took into consideration that as long as anyone in the team was in range, you were as good as in range with everybody in the team. So that was something very unique. And like I said, there was zero internet, there were no radio networks available. So we had to put everything into this little box.
Right, that's pretty cool actually. And of course, with this, there is another important aspect, that is security, right? What happens if the device is kind of dropped off somewhere because of fire, and one of the sathis gets disconnected? So I'm really trying to understand here, what then, right? What are the security protocols that you would see that would come kick in if such a situation was to come about?
Yeah, interestingly, at that time, the biometrics were just coming in. So we even built it in, and we said that every few seconds or minutes you could configure that. If your biometrics were not checked, the device would go off, yeah, virtually. So even if it landed in enemy hands, it was as good as a dodo. I mean, no one could use it. So that was one unique feature that we had built in, assuming that we were operating often in contact with the enemy or behind enemy lines. This would happen that an odd device would get lost or fall in enemy hands. So we built a lot of features. Additionally, all the data was encrypted, very high order encryption, and we ensured that point to point communications were even encrypted over the air additionally, right? So there were several layers of security that we had built in.
That's quite interesting, KPM. And speaking of, building all of this highly tactical and technical gear into this handheld device, must have required a lot of collaboration between institutions. Now, I understand that the armed forces and specifically the Director General of Information Systems had an important role to play in not just leading the process but also seeing it through and deploying it. I think there was also some collaboration with the Indian Institute of Science, and DRDO officials were also involved in the project. So it's quite a rare partnership between industry, a little bit of academia, and of course defense scientists and officials. And as we said at the beginning, it was also led by young practitioners, including yourself. You were involved in the project. So from this kind of a collaboration, KPM, what are some of your takeaways? How was it made possible? And what were the challenges the institutions faced or the development process faced?
Yeah, so this was quite out of the ordinary, very unlike an R&D project. Firstly, it was done by the Indian Army, and not only the team was a very junior team. We had two infantry officers who brought in the experience from Kashmir and the Northeast. We had a technical architect from the signals, and I kind of led the team. What we realized that when good things have to happen, you in total alignment across organizations. So this was in a mission mode, personally, supervised by some of the senior leadership. The deputy chief, Dr. Atre, was the SA to RM and the head of DRDO at that time. We had Vinay Deshpande, who was the CEO of Encore Software. So all of it came together, and resources were on tap, in the sense that we were never constrained. And it was run very tight because we were against a milestone of delivering by 2003 2004. So we had just about 48 to 60 months to do this, and within that it was delivered. The 500 prototypes were trialed, prototype delivered, and eventually it was expected that it would go to production scale.
That's a pretty cool. And KPM, interestingly, when I was looking at the context for the Sathi's development, I found a photo online with the team delivering the prototype to President APJ Abdul Kalam, and you seem to be in that photo, right? So I just wanted to understand from your personal experience what the president had to say about this, and what happened thereafter, right? How did the deployment process work, and how did procurement and acquisition play out?
Sure. So the trials were conducted in a brigade sector in the Northern Command and with a battalion in Central Command. And when the president was out for one of his forward area visits, he was informed of this trial that was going on. So what he did is,
Right.
when he got back to Rashtrapati Bhavan, he wanted to meet the team and go through a personal experience of a demo of this network in the Rashtrapati Bhavan campus. So that is when we had about 3-4 hours of interaction with him, a lot of guidance, some interesting points that he brought out, and we factored into the design after that. Thereafter, it got into the prototype stage, and the pilot, 500 of them. And around that time, that's around the time I had decided to move on from the Indian Army. And I understand the procurement processes was pretty onerous at that time, and this could not be produced at scale and used at scale by the users. That's a different story altogether.
Right. But still, KPM, I'm sure, it would have been quite an experience to at least see the proposal through. And, speaking of procurement being onerous, and of course, the project kind of not being not being seen through at scale. In I think it was in some 2008 that there was a proposal to expand the project with over 1,000 new devices, and the Army Tech Board had shelved it at the time. That was kind of abrupt, given that the nature of the tech and the device was pretty extraordinary. So and then eventually there was no widespread deployment. So like you said, that's another story, right? So what is that story? What went wrong?
Yeah, so I mean, there's nothing that went wrong with the Sati. It was fundamentally, a process issue, at a, in the way the government of India works. Compared to then to now, it's a lot different. It's a lot more flexible. But what would happen is every year, I all I remember is after I left the army, I would get a call almost every year after some major incident. You know, when the Mumbai incident happened, for example, or Pathankot happened, few others, right? And my answer to them when they would call me is yes, it can be revived. It's not a big deal. It's just that we need to kind of bring in update the design and bring it up to speed with the technology available. But it is kind of a device that is always relevant. Even as we speak, I think it is relevant because this actually essentially ensures that the envelope of command and control, digital command and control, goes right up to the soldier.
Right. And, I was just curious. Would you say some of this, of course, procurement and acquisition has come long way since then. There is more flexibility. And there is, I believe, also a renewed push from the government to develop indigenous defense tech, and not just for use in a self-reliant manner, but also for export. But export comes later. But do you think at that time some of the hesitation could also pertain to reinventing the wheel? Of what if something goes wrong and it doesn't prove effective in battlefield? Could it also have been a money issue at that time then?
Yeah, my own assessment is actually it was none of these, right? It was simply that there was no, line directorate, so to speak, in the army headquarters who was willing to take ownership for this. So it fell between the DG Infantry and the DG IS. Because clearly, in terms of cost, for example, a military PDA from the market would cost about $2,500 at that time, and we had produced this device at something like $300 to $400. Yeah. What is more, even before Atmanirbharta became a buzzword, this was actually completely indigenous. It had Hindi interfaces, it had regional interfaces. It was built completely bottom up. The GIS was built out of a two-bedroom apartment in Indiranagar, Bangalore. We did some very
Interesting.
interesting stuff, right? It's such a pity that it was not followed up.
Right. So, speaking of following up on it, I would say today, if we can bring this context now to today, I believe that the Indian Army still doesn't deploy a comparable handheld computer for its infantry, and soldiers on the front lines are still relying on radios, mobile phones, and hand signals. And this is pretty similar to, like you said, what was there at the time. Of course, network technology has come a long way, but the Sathi project remains powerful, and it's a very powerful what if, so to say. And you said it in the podcast just now as well, and you said it in 2019 also in an article or a blog, that the project could be revived quite easily. So do you hold the same belief today?
Absolutely. I mean, if I were to do it again, it would operationally it is still relevant. Technically, we need to do a lot of cool stuff now. I can add agentic AI, I can add haptic interfaces, so that the device is pretty lean and you don't have to interact too much with it, right? Augmented reality, something like Oculus, for example. All of this is possible in a time frame which is far more shorter than what it was 20, 25 years back. So, to my mind, this is eternally relevant from a C3I point of view, and it will add a significant edge as far as the infantry, artillery, and armor operations are concerned.
Right. And just for our listeners, if I can probe a little bit, KPM, what would stuff like agentic AI and haptic interface do for us? How can it help us?
So, I mean, in this operational context, for example, you have, let's say, 100 sathis given to a battalion which is in high altitude, another 100 may be given to a battalion which is operating in counterinsurgency ops. The ability of these devices and the software to learn the context, especially with regard to operations, the time of the year, time of the day, the kind of people who are handling it, the language that is used, all of that can be crafted and the machine would be able to learn by itself. So you would end up with devices which are very, very close to the humans operating it, which are the soldiers at the edge.
Yeah. Yeah, that really brings it to that would really bring it to today's era of warfare, right, where autonomy and uh, intelligentization of military forces, to borrow a Chinese military word, has really become popular. And KPM, in terms of institutional collaboration and partnerships, who do you think would be the best suited to initiate or reinitiate rather this project again? And is there scope for private partnership in at least today, when it's become the government has become much more open to the idea of private partnership in defense?
Absolutely. So from a concept and idea point of view, I think it clearly falls within the Army Design Bureau still. However, from a system integration point of view, you could actually have any of the public sector undertakings involved in it, or you could have even the private sector doing the system integration. As far as building blocks are concerned, and in the architectural building blocks that are concerned, I think the customer should be actively involved. Customer, the Indian Army, they should be actively involved because the specifications and the capabilities that each of these building blocks bring is something that customers would like to get involved in. Once that is done and that abstraction is complete, then it's a matter of any other IT project to deliver. It's not a big deal, honestly.
Right. And in terms of training as well, right? Of course, the customer is the Indian Army, but you said previously that this is a device that goes all the way from the command to of a company or a platoon to the soldier on the ground. And so, if this has to be a reality, what kind of an assessment or training standard would it need, right? For example, from what little I understand of the Indian defense training ecosystem, there is a signals intelligence training college in Mao, and some work on radar intelligence and signals intelligence is done there. But would that, for example, be the right institution if there has to be training in using such a handheld device?
Not at all. In fact, the beauty about this whole architecture, this concept is at the user end, at the UI end, user interface end, it is so
Mhm.
simple that anyone who's operated a mobile phone, personal mobile phone, can do it themselves. Yeah. So therefore, you don't need any heavy duty training program or schedules or things like that. All it requires is very device specific training, and this could even be done in units and formations, right? Wherever these devices are placed. And the way today's generation gets learns and gets trained, you could place everything on the Army intranet platform.
Right. So that then genuinely makes it revolutionary in a lot of ways. And just one, kind of final question, KPM, to wrap this very interesting conversation. We talked about this earlier in the podcast, that at the time that the Sathi was being developed and tested in the early 2000s, even when we produced it and we brought it on the line for the first time, the US military's PDA was also slightly behind in terms of tech. But today, of course, the US military would have also come a long way. And so, if we have to just pit it against that technical standard, what kind of interesting or cool techniques or technologies would we need to bring Sati into new age warfare? I know you talked about agentic AI and haptic interfaces, but would that be enough, or would you need something more, which is a more collaborative effort in the defense ecosystem of the country?
Right. So that's an interesting question. So 23 years back, 25 years back, when we did that project, the component in which we had to do a lot of bespoke work was close to 60 to 70%. Today, my sense is it would be down to something like 20 to 25%. Yeah,
Right.
and a lot of it would be at the user interface end, in sense of the wrapper that you're going to build around it. So there are a lot of commercial technologies. All that you need to do is harden it, because the device needs to be hardened, and therefore that effort would be involved. But outside of that, the life cycle, development and production life cycle would be much, much lesser. You can go through many more iterations in the same amount of time and eventually deliver something which the user can really find useful.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, KPM. Thank you so much for your insights on this very interesting story on the Sathi, and how, of course, we could revive the project and bring it into the new age of warfare, as it were. And, at Takshashila, we often have conversations about how to reform higher defense organization in India, or how to reform and make easier processes of procurement, R&D, manufacturing and acquisition in the country. And this podcast, I feel, feeds nicely into some of those broader conversations. So thank you once again, KPM. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode. Any final thoughts, KPM?
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.